We're reading from Genesis. And what I want to remind you of first as we jump into Genesis 21 is that a couple weeks ago we read Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, God creates everything, and then God says, shoot, I blew it. This creation is a mess. I shouldn't have done it. Right or wrong?
Wrong.
Really?
Yeah.
God looks at everything, says over and over and over, and God looked at what God had just made and saw that it was
Good.
Okay, that makes so much sense. Look around. I mean, even that tree with the broken branch, it like opens up the middle of that tree and it's gorgeous. I could just look at that tree all day long. That tree is a sermon. So of course, God makes the light and the darkness. God makes day and night, the stars, the moon, the sun. God makes the trees and the land. God makes the oceans. God makes the animals and the birds and the little fishies. And God says, it's good. It's good. And God says, okay, that's all really good. This is working for me a lot. Beautiful. And now I'm going to take a big risk and I'm going to make humans. So God makes humans. Then God looks at humans, male and female. God created them. And God said, shoot. Now I really blew it. This is going to ruin everything. Right? Humans ruin everything. Right?
Yeah.
God looks at humans and says, they are
Very
Good.
like stupendously good. They're so good, I give them authority over everything. Whoops, God, hello! No whoops. There's even an extended thought experiment in the Bible. It's called the story of Noah and the flood, where the writers of Genesis explore what if this whole human experiment was a mistake. And now I think the story of Noah is powerful good news. And it's not today's sermon, but I just want you to know the biblical writers thought this same thing and wondered like, whoa, this does not seem to be, we don't see as much goodness as God sees. So maybe the whole experiment should have been reset. And at the end of that story, the end of that, what I call a thought experiment, what if what God does is put God's bow, God's weapon in the sky as a sign for us forever. This is what the rainbow is. Saying, no, I go back to the original. Humans are good. That's what they are at their core. Just to finish off this, like, what about the fall, Phil? I'll give you 10 seconds about the fall. The fall is Adam, we call it the fall. That just means sin entered the world. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible says Adam and Eve ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's when humans decided we're going to decide what's good and what's evil. From then on, we're in the whole rest of Genesis. When we enter the land of judgment, when we don't lay it down and remember who we really are, but when we pick it up and say, we're going to decide, then comes everything else. Then comes everything else. Then comes these stories. With God constantly trying to come back to the people, to us, to say, let me remind you who you really are. So the primary story, the central story in Genesis is the story of Abraham. And in Genesis 12, God comes to Abraham and says, I'm calling you. Calling you, I am blessing you to be a blessing to everyone. And I'm going to do it by making your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as numerous as the grains of sand on the seashore. And then years go by, Abraham and Sarah get old and then older, and we get last week's text, which was God coming back and telling Sarah, you're going to have a baby. And Sarah laughs in God's face. Impossible. So last week we talked about what What we decide is impossible and what God decides are impossible are two very different things. But then we keep forgetting who we are, which is good.
Dependent.
Now, most of us have spent most of our time in church with church or pastors or someone trying to convince us how bad we are. We've got to be convinced about how bad we are so then we can get saved by God. And that is not what the Bible does. The Bible, from its very first chapter, you can quote me on this. The whole Bible starts with Genesis 1. Okay? Take that to the bank. And how it all starts with God saying, I look at this and I say, good. Anytime you want to go against that, oh, humans, that is going to be problems for you. You remember what happens as soon as they do decide to take it into their own hands? Adam and Eve, what do Adam and Eve look like in every painting you've ever seen of Adam and Eve? They're naked. They realize that they're naked. But not just without clothes. Before that, they were naked. We call our prayer of confession our prayer of honesty. We should maybe call it our prayer of nakedness. Outreach and Growth, what do you think? I think we could maybe get some people in here if we advertise. Come to the church with the prayer of nakedness. Right? It's the prayer where we are stripped bare. Now, do you catch the metaphor? But when we're good and we recognize we're good and we're in relationship, we can be completely open. And as soon as we take judgment into our own hands, they realized they were naked and they were ashamed. Now we are not open and free, we are ashamed. Now I don't want you to just be thinking of this age-old story of Adam and Eve. I want you to be thinking of yourself over this past week. Did you spend this past week living into your openness, goodness, nakedness, and freedom? Or did you spend most of this week chasing around in circles around shame? Now, I don't know which it is. I'm not saying, oh, I bet you were ashamed all week. Hopefully you weren't. Hopefully you had moments of kind of openness and freedom and other moments where you stepped into shame. It was probably some mix of both, but it is worth paying attention to. This is exactly what the entire gospel is about. They're naked and ashamed, and that shame led to what we kind of call the first sin, which is their children, Cain and Abel, as they grew up. Cain, jealous of Abel. I'm saying this because it introduces our story, which is a story about jealousy. Jealousy. Shame, this is how it works. Shame leads to jealousy. I don't have enough fingers, there we go. Shame leads to jealousy, leads to spite, leads to violence. This is just how it works. It worked for Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. It's going to work with Sarah and Abraham and Hagar in just a moment. It's how it works for all of us. When we're shamed and we think we're no good, we look out into the world and we think, oh, but that person lives in freedom. That person has what I want. Jealousy. That jealousy, if we let it fester, turns to spite, to hatred. And if we let that fester, it turns to violence. Actual violence, emotional violence. With Cain and Abel, it led to violence that leads to death. In this story, it gets close. All of this, now, okay, where are you going? Are you going down the hole of despair of, oh, I live in jealousy and violence and shame and spite? God says, oh, yeah, notice you're going down that hole. That's a yucky hole. That's a yucky hole to build a society around. How about we come back to goodness? You want to play with me in the garden of goodness? Oh, would I like that, says God. Okay, by the time we get to Genesis 21, amazingly, miraculously, the boy Isaac has been born. The other thing you need to know to understand this story is that when Abraham and Sarah knew that this promise of God for their descendants to be multiple was part of the promise, but also looked at themselves and say, we're too old, this is just not happening. As it says in the Bible, Sarah was not only 90 years old, but she had stopped menstruating. They knew how this worked back 4,000 years ago, and that this does not add up. So Sarah gave her handmaiden, her servant, Hagar, to Abraham and said, Abraham, sleep with Hagar and have a child through Hagar. Hagar did get pregnant, had a son, Ishmael, who was what, like 11 years older than? 13 years older than Isaac. But now we pick up the story after Isaac has been born. Genesis 21, 8 through 21. The boy, and this boy is now Isaac, so Sarah's son, Isaac, grew and stopped nursing. On the day he stopped nursing, Abraham prepared a huge banquet. Sarah saw Hagar's son laughing, which is fantastically ironic because Isaac's name means he laughs. But she sees not her son laughing, but Ishmael laughing. Hagar's son Ishmael laughing. The one Hagar the Egyptian had born to Abraham. So she said to Abraham, send this servant away with her son. This servant's son won't share the inheritance with my son Isaac. This upset Abraham terribly because the boy was his son. God said to Abraham, don't be upset about the boy and your servant. Do everything Sarah tells you to do because your descendants will be traced through Isaac, but I will make of your servant's son a great nation too, because he is also your descendant. Abraham got up early in the morning, took some bread and a flask of water and gave it to Hagar. He put the boy in her shoulder sling and sent her away. She left and wandered through the desert near Beersheba. Finally, the water in the flask ran out, and she put the boy down under one of the desert shrubs. She walked away from him about as far as a bow shot and sat down, telling herself, I can't bear to see the boy die. She sat at a distance, cried out in grief, and wept. God heard the boy's cries. And God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, Hagar, what's wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy's cries over there. Get up, pick up the boy, and take him by the hand, because I will make of him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well. She went over, filled the water flask, and gave the boy a drink. God remained with the boy. He grew up, lived in the desert, and became an expert archer. What was it that God put in the sky at the end of the flood story?
Rainbow.
A bow. I'm not going to say anything more about that. I just want that to be evocative. Okay, I want to explore this brokenness, shame, jealousy comparison through three characters quite quickly. I know it's chilly. I want to look briefly at Sarah, and then Abraham, and then Hagar, or Hagar Ishmael. Okay, so first, Sarah. For both Sarah and Abraham, this should be one of the happiest days of their life. This weaning from nursing, it's like sort of maybe like we would do a first birthday celebration. It's like really welcome to the world. It's partly with infant mortality as high as it was. It's like you made it out of the worst danger. We can actually start loving you now, kind of thing. So it's a big day, and you can see they're making a big celebration out of it. And Sarah, jealousy, when you're not in the jealousy situation, usually looks ludicrous, right? Most people, when you look from the out, like, what? Well, you've got all this good stuff and you're jealous? Like, are you joking? That's what this looks like, right? When you look from the outside, like, Sarah, you have got to be kidding. You just had this miraculous pregnancy and birth. Your son is healthy, just reached the age of weaning. You're having the big party. Sit back and enjoy the roast goat, for Pete's sake. It's a great day. And no, she sees the other one laughing. And the shame, the jealousy, the spite burn inside of her. It doesn't really even give commentary. It doesn't give background. It doesn't give, because of Sarah's childhood, we just do not know. But instead of trying to guess about Sarah, I want us to just think briefly about how jealousy works in our own lives. And I'm going to start by thinking how it works kind of big picture and then come back. But for all of this, I want you to think, how does it work for you? Yourself, and you look out in the world, what do your thought patterns tend to do? But our culture has a major, major problem with jealousy. We have whole industries essentially built around it. Okay, we have our best and our smartest go into the advertising industry, and they are smart about how we think, and they get it. But here's another place where I've been disturbed by it lately, and it's watching how our politics works. And I'm not going to get into specifics because this works every single direction. But if your party, if my party, if one's party is not in power, I want you to think, how do we respond this way? First, I want you to think, what's the opposite of jealousy? Don't say anything out loud. Just think about that for a minute. Any of you don't have word? Jealousy is a kind of closing in. Even though it's looking out, it's going like, ugh. The opposite of jealousy is something like open-hearted acceptance. So now, I want you to think, to me this is almost humorous how crazily not true this is. When your party loses and the other party takes power, how much open-hearted acceptance do you feel in our culture? It's unbelievable! Because one party will go, that other party, they're just obstructionists, they're just naysayers, that's all they can do is say no, 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 and then it switches, and the party who was just saying that, we are going to obstruct, we are going to stop, we're doing nothing, 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 nothing. That's, so I say you could say, how bad it is in Washington. Or you could think, how much, when things don't go my way, do I respond with open-hearted acceptance? If you want to know what the fall looks like, that's what it looks like. That's what it feels like. Every day, every moment, we can do shame, jealousy, spite, violence, or we can respond with open-hearted trust and acceptance. Okay, Sarah doesn't. Sarah is caught in the shame, jealousy, spite, vengeance, so she asks for vengeance. Now, in a couple of sentences, God's going to say, don't worry about that. Now remember, as we're thinking about how we respond, we have to always remember, God is not going down that hole with us. God is right there being, good, good. God has amazing open-hearted acceptance to us. God says, tree branch breaks, I can work with that. God says, Sarah going down the hole of shame, jealousy, spite, vengeance, I can work with that. God's promises, God's goodness, God's view of our goodness never changes. Okay, Abraham. Abraham is having maybe the best day of his life. And then he's asked to kill his own son. This is a theme that continues because, by the way, right when they get through this one and it has a pretty happy ending, You know what the next story is? God says, go take Isaac up to this hill and sacrifice him to me. So God has some vision of this goodness that goes beyond these practical pieces of life. But now I just want you to think. First, I just asked you to think about the jealous side of yourself and how you respond to life. Now I want you to think, do you have stories about fantastic days or moments when it seems like everything is going well and then the absolute worst happens? Very quickly, I remember being in San Francisco for the very first time when I was in college on an off-campus program. I was just there for a long weekend. It was one of the most life-changing weeks of my life. I was a Grand Rapids, Michigan Dutch Reform boy. I had not seen much of the world, and I got dropped in the middle of San Francisco, and it was amazing. I got offered drugs for the very first time. I didn't even know it was happening, so I did not accept that offer. I was exposed to a kind of diversity of humanity way beyond whatever I had before, and it was, I was having a blast. It was heart-changing and mind-changing and kind of overwhelming. And that night when I went back to the youth hostel, there was a message from my parents. This is way before cell phones, and so they had just called the youth hostel and left a message. Please call me, stumble out of the youth hostel, find a payphone, remember those? And found out that my best friend back at Calvin College had stepped into the East Beltline, was hit by a car, and was immediately dead. One of the best weekends of my life, bam. Up all night, crazy cab ride to the airport, flying home, morning, coming back, a changed person. It happened to Abraham right here. He had been holding on to this promise for decades. The promise they're having, they're having a party. It's just like the most fantastic day ever. And then shame, jealousy, spite, vengeance. And it's not even his. So now he's caught, he just went from this unbelievable, never thought this win-win situation would happen, and now he gets thrown into lose-lose. Because what? He puts his foot down and says no, and he knows there's 1,000 ways Sarah could make Hagar and Ishmael's life miserable. He knows there's no way out of this. He says yes, and Hagar and Ishmael are going to die. And God says to him, oh, Abraham, open-hearted acceptance. So I want to take just a moment and let you know how crazy faith is. If you, when the band sang "Lay It Down," well, yeah, I've got some worries I want to lay down. I've got some concerns I want to lay down. I've got some parenting techniques I'd like to lay down. How about letting one of my sons go into the wilderness to die? Okay, now I actually don't want to lay that down. I'd like to pick that up and change the freaking story. And God says, oh no, Abraham, lay it down. See, if anything stands between us and God's love, we lay it down. Okay, the last one is Hagar and Ishmael. Oh, I love it. I don't love this. It's a tricky part of this story that they have no agency in this story. Did you notice that? By agency, I just mean like power to affect what's happening. They just get given this piece of bread and this one flask of water and sent out into the desert. And don't say they tried to sneak back in. They're just they're just gone. So here's my next question for you. Have you ever had things happen that you had no power over that messed up everything? Did you ever have things that happened to you that you had no power of that threatened your life? Did you ever have sickness come that you did not plan for? Did you ever have an accident that did not work into your plans for the day at all? Did you ever get your heart broken by somebody else? Ever have your life threatened? well, then you understand what it was like to be Hagar and Ishmael. Did you ever lay it down to the point where you had to abandon because you couldn't stand to be there? If this was videotapable, it probably happened about 4,000 years ago. And all of these choices are just as alive for us as they were for the characters in this story. We get to decide at every moment. I mean, shouldn't Hagar be plotting vengeance? Ishmael becomes one of the best bow shots in the whole Middle East, in the ancient Middle East. Aren't there some people to kill and get vengeance on after this story? Notice it doesn't go that direction. We have a choice. We have a choice in how we do our political conversations. We have a choice in how we do our religious conversation. Each one of us has a choice every day. Because the temptation to shame, jealousy, spite, and then acting out in violence is there for us every moment. That real things, tricky things, bad things are going to happen to us this week. And we get to choose. Oh yeah, God says, the very first thing God says to me is, I am good. The very core thing God wants me to know is goodness. And God looks out at all the rest of creation and says, good. God looks at all the other people. All the other people. God looks at all the other people and says, good. And then the whole Bible, from stories like Sarah and Abraham and Hagar, from the story of Jesus to the preaching and teaching of the Apostle Paul, say, I want you to look at each other like you look at that deer right now. Are you wondering about the original sinfulness of that deer? You wondering what trauma that deer went through in childhood that she is acting so badly in the world right now? You trying to figure out whether that deer is a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian? People of God, it's called faith. It's open-hearted acceptance. It's laying it down and in every situation trusting God. Amen.
Before the throne of God above, I have a strong and perfect plea, a great high priest whose name is love, whoever lives and pleads for me. My name is written on his hands, my name is written on his heart. I know that while in heaven he stands, no tongue can bid me thence depart. No tongue can bid me thence depart. When Satan tempts me to despair and tells me of the guilt within, upward I look and see him there, made an end of all my sin. Because a sinless Savior died, my sinful soul is counted free, or God the just is satisfied to look on him and pardon me, to look on him and pardon me. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God. Behold him there, the risen Lamb, my perfect spotless righteousness, the great unchangeable I am, the King of glory and of grace. One in himself, I cannot die. My soul is purchased by his blood. My life is hid with Christ on high, with Christ my Savior and my God, with Christ my Savior and my God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God.